You stand, not in a muddy battlefield or a marble court, but in the polished, suffocating air of 19th century London. The year is 1875. The real pressure of this empire is not the steam of the factories or the roar of the sea, but the collective, unrelenting gaze of society. Every glance is a judgment, every whispered rumor a potential sentence of ostracization. Before the dawn of scientific psychology, there was only the constant, invisible force of moral correction. The question is not what they did, but what they were forced not to do, and the lengths to which they went to ensure nobody saw the cost. The Victorians did not fear death or disease as much as they feared disrespectability. This was an age that attempted to build a fortress around the human spirit, defining purity not by faith but by outward restraint. The ruling class, driven by an acute awareness of global competition and social stratification, believed that internal discipline was the bedrock of imperial power. If a man could not control his desires, how could he control an entire continent? This was the philosophical scaffolding upon which the entire architecture of Victorian restraint was built, a complex system where the moral failings of one were seen as a direct threat to the stability of the many. To embody this omnipresent judgment, society invented a specter, Mrs. Grundy. She was not a real person, but a character, an unseen, off-stage presence from an earlier play, who quickly became the shorthand for the tyrannical standard of social propriety. You are constantly aware of Mrs. Grundy's hypothetical opinion. Her gaze dictates the height of a skirt, the depth of a conversation, and the placement of furniture. She is the ultimate, non-negotiable peer pressure, a fictional entity whose authority exceeded that of the Queen herself in the drawing rooms and private chambers of Britain. 10 years later, the sheer weight of this invisible scrutiny would begin to crack the very foundation it was meant to uphold. The stakes were profoundly personal: the loss of standing, the ruin of a family name, and the denial of dignity. The systems designed to enforce control were often insidious, focusing on the intimate details of private life. For men, the concerns centered on retaining energy for civic and industrial pursuits. Physicians and moralists alike warned of the dangers of personal indulgence, claiming it drained the vital fluids necessary for rational thought and economic production. This fear manifested in extraordinary ways, driven by panic regarding insanity and physical deterioration, the ultimate psychological weapon wielded against self-exploration. You must understand the profound irony. An age obsessed with biological discovery simultaneously embraced medical claims that seem wildly irrational today. Scientific literature, widely distributed, linked internal personal acts to conditions like paleness, weight fluctuation, and even madness. These were not fringe theories. They were mainstream medical warnings, creating an environment where a simple, natural urge became synonymous with self-destruction and social failure. The result was a culture of self-policing, where the threat of medical ruin enforced moral compliance more effectively than any law could. The burden on women was fundamentally different. They were tasked with being the moral gatekeepers of the household. Womanhood was divided into two unforgiving archetypes: the pure, frigid angel of the hearth, or the fallen, morally bankrupt deviant. There was no middle ground. Wives were taught, even through widely circulated marital guides, techniques of evasion and denial, feigned fatigue, sudden headaches, or the imperative need to attend to urgent, unseen matters. The marital bed became a moral battlefield, where the wife's primary function was to moderate the husband's biological drives, not share intimacy. This institutionalized coldness was seen as essential for maintaining her own elevated social status. Imagine the weight of this expectation. A woman's entire social identity and that of her children rested on her perfect performance of chastity and restraint. Any hint of pleasure beyond the strict goal of procreation was deemed a descent into the deviant category, forfeiting her dignity. This hyper-focus created an atmosphere of deep distrust and suppressed emotion within the home, turning the most natural of human experiences into a transaction fraught with anxiety. It was a societal contract where psychological intimacy was sacrificed at the altar of public respectability. The inevitable result of extreme repression is the growth of a a hidden economy of desire and necessity, while the public face of Victorian society was one of rigid propriety. A thriving, often brutal underworld of forbidden indulgence existed just beneath the surface. This hidden life included the proliferation of clandestine literature and, crucially, the system of the fallen woman. She was the living symbol of the system's failure. Yet, paradoxically, she provided a necessary outlet for the very desires society pretended did not exist. This duality, the angel at home and the shadow in the street, was the great hypocritical secret of the era. The women of the streets, designated as fallen, were ironically the only women in Victorian society who possessed a degree of financial autonomy, free from the direct economic control of a father or husband. This limited, perilous freedom was precisely why society condemned them so fiercely, labeling them to dissuade other young women from seeking independence. The term fallen was not merely moral condemnation, it was an economic warning against self-determination. They were seen as corrupting influences, not because of their actions, but because they had opted out of the restrictive marital economy. This subterranean world, however, quickly became a public health crisis. The rampant spread of sexually transmitted infections, STIs, was seen not as a failure of social behavior, but as a failure of containment. In 1864, the government responded with the Contagious Diseases Acts. You see the ultimate betrayal here. These laws did not target the male patrons, but exclusively the women. Police were granted powers to detain any woman suspected of being a street worker and force her into examination. If diseased, she was incarcerated in a lock hospital for up to 9 months. These laws codified a devastating double standard. Men were considered biologically incapable of controlling their urges, a force of nature requiring an outlet, while women were deemed responsible for containing the moral and biological fallout. This legal framework was a clear message. The state was interested in protecting the male body, especially the military and navy, and male honor, while the dignity and freedom of the woman were utterly dispensable in the pursuit of social purity. It was the moment state control moved from moral persuasion to physical subjugation. The sheer injustice of the Contagious Diseases Acts ignited a moral counter-movement, the social purity campaigns. Driven largely by women who recognized the deep hypocrisy, these activists did not demand sexual liberation, but rather equal application of the moral code. They were, in a sense, demanding that men be held to the same impossibly high standards of abstinence and restraint as women. These activists, often referred to as New Puritans, saw all forms of non-procreative intimacy as a threat to the family, and, therefore, the empire. This era saw the policing of desire reach its apex, extending even to the private lives of consensual adults. Where public indecency laws had previously governed behavior, the legislative hammer fell with the Labouchere Amendment in 1885. This law made any gross indecency between men a criminal offense, regardless of whether the act was private or public, consensual or non-consensual. It created a legal instrument to systematically purge certain forms of human intimacy from public and private life, turning affection into a potentially life-ruining crime. Forbidden years after this law was passed, the full, devastating power of this puritanical shift crystallized in the trial of Oscar Wilde. You watch as the greatest wit and artistic voice of the age is publicly dismantled, not for a crime of violence, but for the transgression of his private life. His conviction and subsequent imprisonment under conditions of severe, hard labor were less about the law itself and more about a calculated public reaffirmation of Mrs. Grundy's absolute authority. The message was clear: no degree of talent or influence could protect you from the crushing weight of enforced morality. The cultural fallout from the Wilde trial was immediate and chilling. It drove non-conforming expression further underground, increasing the atmosphere of paranoia and surveillance. The Victorians had managed to weaponize shame and social control to an extent perhaps unmatched in modern history. The tragedy of Wilde was the climax of the era's repression, a spectacular, state-sanctioned destruction of a brilliant individual to satisfy the collective anxiety that threatened the highly ordered, yet fundamentally unstable, structure of their society. By the turn of the century, the strictures began to fray. Societal control, when pushed to such extremes, inevitably breeds its own own counter-reaction. The very intensity of the repression created a profound awareness of the psychological cost, prompting early reflections on the inner life and the necessity of genuine emotional expression. Yet the foundational moral codes and the ingrained paranoia did not simply vanish. They became ghosts in the machine, shaping institutions and influencing public discourse for decades to come, especially regarding women's bodily autonomy and mental health. The Victorian anxiety over propriety left a permanent mark on the Western understanding of intimacy, framing it less as a natural aspect of life and more as a powerful, volatile force that must be contained, measured, and rationed. Even medical texts emerging well into the 20th century, like those promoting the notion of simultaneous climax as the only sign of a successful union, illustrate the lasting compulsion to apply quantitative external rules to the most subjective human experiences. The need for control outlived the era itself. You reflect now on the purpose of this relentless control. It wasn't merely religious zeal, though that played a part. It was the mechanics of power. By regulating the most private aspects of life, the elite maintained order, channeled energies toward production, and ensured social stability through rigid family structures. They sought to manage the inner life of the citizen, believing that a compliant, restrained individual was the necessary raw material for an unshakable empire. This system valued social performance over psychological authenticity, creating generations of people living masked lives. The paradox remains. The Victorian era, defined globally by explosive expansion, industrial ambition, and technological triumph, was internally defined by its utter paralysis regarding the human spirit. It mastered the world, but failed fundamentally at mastering itself, trading genuine human connection for the cold comfort of respectability. We look back and see the relics of their struggle, the moral paradoxes, the forgotten laws, the ruined reputations, and we realize that this history is not just about strange customs. It is about the eternal human tension between the impulse to conform and the necessity to be free. This video is created for educational and historical purposes. It examines themes of power, corruption, and human conflict without depicting explicit or graphic events. The goal is to provide insight into the psychological and social mechanisms of historical control and the moral dilemmas faced by people of the era. We aim to understand the systems, not sensationalize the suffering. The complexities of these historical moral codes offer a vital lens through which we can examine our own modern sensitivities and the ongoing struggle between individual freedom and societal expectation. If this story made you reflect on how easily power turns to cruelty, or how social anxiety can legislate away personal freedom, stay with us. We delve into the difficult truths of history, not to judge the past, but to understand the enduring mechanisms of human darkness and resilience that continue to echo today. The questions raised by Mrs. Grundy's unseen gaze, who controls morality and at what cost to the individual, are questions that never truly disappear. Subscribe for the next chapter from the darker corners of human history, where we continue to seek the quiet, crimson truth.